9 students. Fake weapons. One plane. One impossible plan. And a government so desperate they built an entire fake country overnight just to stop them. And somehow, even that wasn't enough. March 31st, 1970. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The kind of morning where nothing feels like it could go wrong. Coffee cups steaming gently on tray tables, newspapers rustling between fingers, businessmen glancing at their watches, already mentally rehearsing presentations for meetings that, for some of them, would never happen. The air smelled of jet fuel and fresh bread from the terminal bakery. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency. Pilots completed their checklists. Everything was functioning exactly as it was supposed to. Nobody on board Japan Airlines Flight 351 had any idea that within the next 79 hours, their names would appear in headlines across every major newspaper on Earth, that their faces would be broadcast on television screens from Washington to Moscow, that the governments of 3 countries would be thrown into complete crisis because of 9 people who should have been sitting in lecture halls. Not trained terrorists, not military operatives with satellite communications and years of field experience. University students. Ordinary young people who had eaten breakfast that morning, packed their bags, and walked onto a commercial aircraft with a plan that had no real exit strategy and weapons that couldn't actually kill anyone. One member of the group was 16 years old, a high school student who had never even been on an international flight. Another was the bassist of a well-known Japanese rock band, a musician who had traded his instrument for a prop pistol and a revolutionary manifesto. And here is the detail that will genuinely make your head spin. Almost every single weapon they carried onto that aircraft was completely fake. Replicas, stage props, the kind of things you'd find in a costume shop. Yet with those fake weapons, those 9 young people managed to hold 122 passengers hostage across 3 countries, trigger a 50-hour diplomatic standoff between Japan and South Korea, force the CIA and South Korean intelligence to construct an elaborate fake version of North Korea on a real airport tarmac overnight, and rewrite aviation security history forever. So how did they do it? How did a group of students with toy guns and a samurai sword come within a portrait painting of pulling off the impossible? Sit down, because this story does not go where you think it's going. Not even close. 7:33 a.m. The engines climb to full power. Flight 351 lifts cleanly off Haneda's runway into a crisp, cloudless Tokyo morning, the city falling away beneath it like a detailed map. 122 passengers aboard, 7 crew members. A Boeing 727-100, a workhorse aircraft designed specifically for short to medium domestic routes, the kind of plane that made this particular journey dozens of times a week without incident. The flight to Fukuoka was scheduled to take just under an hour, a domestic hop, barely enough time to finish a cup of coffee. Pilots had done it so many times, the route felt like muscle memory. Seated near a window in economy class was Herbert Brill, a senior executive at Pepsi-Cola, Japan, reviewing papers in his lap. A few rows behind him, Father Daniel MacDonald, a Roman Catholic priest visiting from New York, quietly read his morning breviary, one finger tracing the words on the page. Scattered throughout the cabin, university students heading home for spring break, their bags stuffed with textbooks and cheap snacks, surgeons traveling to a medical conference, tourists who had spent 2 weeks photographing cherry blossoms and were now carrying handmade souvenirs back to families waiting at Fukuoka arrivals. Regular people with regular plans, dinner reservations at 7, job interviews scheduled for tomorrow morning, a grandmother expecting her grandchildren at the front door. None of them had done anything to deserve what was about to happen to them. They had simply bought a ticket and shown up on time. Captain Shinji Ishida sat in command of the flight deck with the steady, unhurried confidence of a man who had made this crossing more times than he could count. The sky was exceptionally clear. Below them, the iconic cone of Mount Fuji appeared through the cockpit window, white-capped, perfectly symmetrical, glowing in the early morning light like something out of a woodblock print. The seatbelt sign clicked off with a soft chime. Passengers shifted in their seats, unfolded newspapers. The cabin crew began assembling their service trolleys, wheels squeaking softly on the aisle floor. Everything was operating exactly as it should. Altitude stable, course set. Passengers relaxed. The world outside was nothing but open sky and soft white cloud. And then, directly above Mount Fuji, at cruising altitude, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, the world inside that cabin cracked open. A man stood up from his seat. His name was Takamaru Tamiya, 27 years old. The kind of face that belongs in a university seminar room, angular, serious, sharp-eyed. He looked like someone about to ask a difficult question in a political philosophy lecture. He had boarded the plane like everyone else, walked through the gate, found his seat, buckled his belt, smiled politely at the passenger next to him. Nothing about him screamed danger, nothing at all. But as he stood in the aisle, he reached beneath his jacket and drew out a sword. Long, traditional, Japanese, the blade catching the overhead cabin lighting and throwing a thin line of silver across the ceiling. For 1 full second, the entire cabin simply froze. And then, before a single person could speak, before a single hand could reach for a call button, 8 more people rose from their seats. Spread across the full length of the cabin, front to back, left to right, as though they had been positioned there deliberately, because they had. They had boarded separately, sat apart, avoided eye contact with each other for the entire boarding process. They had waited until the aircraft reached cruising altitude, until the seatbelt sign went off, until everyone was at their most relaxed. Then they moved, together, in silence, all at once. Some held what appeared to be pistols, small, black, deadly-looking. Others displayed what seemed to be pipe bombs, cylindrical and wrapped in dark tape. One man near the rear of the cabin held an axe, its blade catching the light exactly the way Tamiya's sword had. The effect was instantaneous and total. A woman near the window let out a sharp scream that cut off abruptly. A child grabbed its mother's arm. A businessman in the third row pressed himself so hard against his seat that the frame creaked. Several passengers simply stopped breathing, as though silence might make them invisible. Then Tamiya's voice filled the cabin. Not shouting, not hysterical, but controlled and absolutely certain. "This aircraft has been hijacked. Do not move. Do not call for help. Anyone who resists, this plane will be destroyed." The word destroyed landed in the cabin like a physical weight. People stopped crying. They stopped shifting. They sat perfectly still, staring at the weapons glinting in the artificial light, and they believed every single word. To reinforce the message, several hijackers moved through the cabin and began tying the male passengers to their seats with rope, methodically, efficiently, working their way row by row while the others kept watch with their weapons raised. Moments later, Tamiya and two others forced their way through the cockpit door. Captain Ishida turned to find a sword at his throat and a pistol pressed to the side of his head. The demand was delivered without hesitation. "Fly this plane to Cuba. Now." The age of aviation innocence died right there. 30,000 feet above the perfect white cone of Mount Fuji. To understand the 9 people who had just seized control of a commercial aircraft with what appeared to be deadly weapons, you have to go back further. You have to understand the Japan they grew up in, because they didn't appear out of nowhere. They were created, slowly, by decades of history pressing down on a generation with nowhere to put its anger. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the country didn't just lose a war, it lost its entire identity. The empire was gone. The military was dissolved. Thousands of cities lay in rubble. And into that vacuum of power and meaning, the United States moved with extraordinary speed, establishing military bases, reshaping the political system, rebuilding the economy on American terms, and doing all of it so thoroughly that within 15 years it was genuinely difficult to tell where American influence ended and Japanese sovereignty began. By the early 1960s, a new generation of Japanese young people, people who had grown up after the war, who had no memory of the empire and no nostalgia for it, were looking at their country and asking an uncomfortable question. Whose country is this, exactly? They watched the Japanese government sign treaties with Washington that allowed American military installations to remain on Japanese soil indefinitely. They watched politicians who seemed more interested in pleasing foreign allies than representing their own citizens. They watched American soldiers live and operate in their country with a legal immunity that felt like a second-class status for Japan's own people. The universities became the flashpoint. Student unions transformed into political battlegrounds. Campus buildings were barricaded. Riot police clashed with protesters carrying wooden staves. The air on Japanese university campuses in the late 1960s was thick with tear gas and ideology and genuine, burning fury. Out of this atmosphere emerged the Red Army faction, Sekigunha in Japanese, a group that decided marches and petitions and sit-ins were not enough. They were Marxist revolutionaries who believed that the entire global capitalist order needed to be dismantled by force and replaced with a communist system. Not just in Japan, everywhere. Their ideology was genuinely international in scope. They didn't just want to liberate Japan from American influence, they wanted to ignite a worldwide revolution, connecting revolutionary movements across Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East into a single coordinated uprising against capitalism and imperialism. Their immediate plan was straightforward, if completely insane in execution. Reach Cuba where Fidel Castro had already built a functioning communist state that had stared down the United States at point-blank range. Train there militarily, acquire weapons and tactical knowledge, return to Japan, and begin the armed struggle that would trigger the revolution. The mastermind of the hijacking plan was Takaya Shiomi, the Red Army faction's most prominent leader. He had designed the entire operation, the target, the timing, the method. But he was arrested by Japanese police just weeks before the plan was supposed to launch, his apartment raided, his documents seized. Any rational group would have stopped there, would have regrouped, reconsidered, maybe abandoned the plan entirely. These 9 did not stop. They looked at the empty space where their leader used to be, looked at each other, and got on the plane anyway. Among them was Moriaki Wakabayashi, the bassist of Les Rallies Dénudés, one of Japan's most experimental and influential rock bands. He had played venues across Japan, had fans who knew his face, had a career that was actually going somewhere. He walked away from all of it to carry a prop weapon onto a commercial flight. The youngest member was not yet 17. He was, by any legal and practical definition, a child. Someone who should have been studying for exams and worrying about university entrance tests, not sitting on a hijacked aircraft with a fake pistol tucked into his jacket. They were angry. They were idealistic. They were young enough to believe that certainty was the same thing as being right. And they were catastrophically, irreparably wrong. Inside the cockpit, with a sword pressed against his neck and a pistol pointed at his temple, Captain Shinji Ishida listened to Takamaro Tamiya's demand with extraordinary steadiness. Cuba. The hijackers wanted to be flown to Havana, Cuba, Fidel Castro's communist island, America's greatest ideological enemy in the Western Hemisphere, and the place where they planned to train for revolution. Havana, Cuba, from Tokyo, Japan, approximately 13,000 kilometers, across the Pacific Ocean, over the continental United States or through Southeast Asia, depending on the route. A journey that, even on a long-haul aircraft with multiple fuel stops, takes the better part of a day. This was a Boeing 727-100, a short to medium-range domestic aircraft. Its maximum range on a full tank of fuel was approximately 4,700 kilometers. They were being asked to fly almost 3 times that distance on an aircraft that was never designed to leave the country. These were the people who had spent months planning a revolution, who had studied Marxist theory, read Che Guevara, debated geopolitics in late-night sessions. Not one of them had apparently spent 30 minutes looking at the specifications of the aircraft they were planning to hijack. Captain Ishida explained this calmly, without emotion, the way a pilot explains turbulence to a nervous passenger. This aircraft cannot reach Cuba. Physically impossible. We would run out of fuel somewhere over the Pacific and fall into the ocean. There was a pause. Tamiya and his group pulled back slightly and conferred in urgent, hushed tones. The cockpit felt very small and very quiet. After several minutes, Tamiya returned with a revised demand. North Korea, then. Pyongyang, the capital of Kim Il-sung's Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Communist, anti-American, geographically achievable from Japan with a fuel stop, and, the hijackers hoped, politically sympathetic to their cause. North Korea was close enough, the range was feasible, and a country that had been in a state of technical war with the United States since 1950 seemed like exactly the kind of place that might welcome 9 Japanese revolutionary students with open arms. Captain Ishida heard this new demand, nodded, and immediately began constructing a lie. He told Tamiya that the aircraft didn't have enough fuel even for North Korea, that they would need to land at their original destination, Fukuoka, to refuel. He also mentioned that he didn't have navigation charts for the Korean peninsula on board. They'd need to pick those up in Fukuoka as well. Both statements were false. There was sufficient fuel. There were charts. But Tamiya had no way to verify any of this, and the sword in his hand was not the same thing as aviation expertise. There was a long moment in the cockpit. Tamiya looked at the captain. The captain held his gaze. Then Tamiya agreed to land at Fukuoka. What Tamiya didn't know was that in that same moment, Captain Ishida was quietly transmitting an emergency signal to air traffic control. Not over the main radio frequency where it might be overheard, through a secondary channel, a discreet, practiced transmission. The message was simple. We have been hijacked. They want North Korea. On the ground, the trap was already beginning to form. At approximately 9 a.m., the wheels of Flight 351 touched down on the runway at Fukuoka's Itazuke Airport. The moment the aircraft slowed to a stop, the perimeter transformed. Japanese authorities had been monitoring the situation since Ishida's emergency transmission. Police units surrounded the aircraft at a distance. SWAT teams positioned themselves behind vehicles and terminal walls. Negotiators were brought forward. Medical teams waited on standby. But the hijackers had anticipated some kind of response. Tamiya immediately made clear over the cockpit radio what would happen if anyone approached the aircraft or attempted any kind of forced entry. The plane, he said, would be destroyed. Every person aboard. The threat was entirely credible. As far as anyone on the ground knew, those weapons were real. The pipe bombs appeared genuine. The pistols looked authentic. No one standing on that tarmac had any way of knowing they were looking at props. What followed was a masterclass in the specific, grinding patience required to negotiate with people who hold hostages and believe they have nothing to lose. Japanese officials began a slow, methodical back and forth with Tamiya through the aircraft radio. The proposition the authorities put forward was measured and deliberate. Release some of the passengers, particularly those in the most vulnerable categories, and in exchange, the aircraft would be refueled and provided with the navigation materials it needed. The negotiation took hours. Tamiya pushed back, demanded guarantees, threatened multiple times to end the conversation entirely. The officials on the ground held firm, kept their voices level, and waited. At 1:35 p.m., 6 hours after landing, Tamiya agreed. 23 passengers were released from the aircraft, women with young children, elderly travelers, several individuals who were visibly ill or had medical conditions that required attention. For those 23 people, the moment they stepped off that aircraft and felt the Fukuoka tarmac beneath their feet was one of the most profound experiences of their lives. Several collapsed immediately into the arms of waiting medical personnel. Others simply stood still and looked at the sky, unable to process that they were out. The navigation materials that were handed over to the aircraft in exchange for those 23 passengers deserve a moment of attention. What the authorities provided was not a professional aviation chart. It was not an official navigation document of any kind. It was a photocopy, slightly crooked, printed on ordinary paper, of a page from a school atlas, a child's educational textbook map of the Korean peninsula, showing the two countries in different colors, with a dotted line indicating the border between them, and the names written in simple text. That was the navigation document for what was supposed to be the opening act of a global communist revolution. A school atlas photocopy. But tucked quietly onto that same piece of paper, so small and understated that it would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, was a notation in the margin. A radio frequency, 121.5 megacycles, the International Aviation Emergency Frequency. And beside it, a few brief characters that Captain Ishida, the moment he saw them, understood completely. The notation told him where to land. It wasn't Pyongyang. At approximately 2 p.m., after 5 hours on the ground at Fukuoka, Flight 351 taxied to the runway and lifted off again, heading northwest toward the Korean peninsula. Inside the cabin, the remaining passengers, still bound, still terrified, still uncertain whether they would survive, sat in silence and listened to the engines, and tried not to think about where they were going. The hijackers sat with the quiet satisfaction of people who believe they have won. They had outwitted the Japanese authorities. They had secured their fuel and their map. North Korea was an hour away. The revolution was within reach. None of them had the faintest idea what was actually waiting for them on the ground. While Flight 351 was still sitting on the tarmac at Fukuoka, something extraordinary was happening 600 kilometers away in Seoul, South Korea. Japanese government officials had been in urgent contact with South Korean authorities and with American intelligence almost from the moment the hijacking began. The CIA, which maintained a significant operational presence in South Korea, was brought into the conversation early. What emerged from those frantic hours of communication was a plan so bold, so logistically complex, and so fundamentally theatrical that it is difficult to believe it was conceived and executed in a matter of hours. The idea was this: Flight 351 would not be allowed to reach Pyongyang. Instead, it would be diverted to Seoul's Gimpo Airport, and Gimpo Airport would be transformed as completely and as quickly as humanly possible into a convincing replica of Pyongyang's Sunan International Airport. Consider what that actually meant. In the space of a few hours, with an aircraft already in the air and approaching, the South Korean authorities had to change the appearance of a major international airport. The signage, the personnel, the aircraft, the vehicles on the tarmac, the uniforms of the soldiers positioned around the perimeter, to match a city and an airport that most of the people doing the work had never visited. South Korean military personnel changed out of their standard uniforms into outfits designed to suggest North Korean army dress. North Korean flags were sourced, produced, and hung around the terminal building and along the arrival area. Banners were printed and erected, large, prominent, written in Korean, welcoming the aircraft and its revolutionary passengers to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Women were positioned at the base of the arrival stairs in traditional Korean dress, holding flowers, ready to welcome the hijackers as heroes. A group of children was assembled near the terminal, rehearsed to sing patriotic songs. A loudspeaker system was prepared with a recorded announcement, written to sound like an official North Korean government welcome broadcast. And then, perhaps the most audacious element of the entire deception, South Korean Air Force jets were scrambled and given specific instructions. When Flight 351 approached the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, those jets were to intercept the aircraft, fire warning shots around it, not at it, but close enough to be genuinely frightening, and then fall into a guiding formation, as though escorting the aircraft to Pyongyang. The warning shots would sell the illusion that they were crossing into hostile airspace, just as a real approach to North Korea would have involved. Through the entire flight from Fukuoka to Seoul, Captain Ishida was communicating on the emergency frequency he had been given. He knew exactly where he was going. He flew a route that kept him far enough from the actual North Korean border to avoid any genuinely dangerous confrontation, while making it appear to the hijackers that they were penetrating deep into the peninsula and approaching Pyongyang from the south. When the aircraft began its descent and the first fighter jets appeared through the clouds, real South Korean military aircraft, close enough that their markings were visible, and opened fire with warning bursts, the effect in the cabin was exactly what the planners had hoped for. Passengers screamed. Several believed they were being shot down. The hijackers gripped their weapons and braced themselves. But then the firing stopped, and a voice came over the radio, calm, official-sounding, in Korean, welcoming the aircraft and providing landing instructions. And the hijackers erupted. They embraced each other. Tamiya's eyes filled with tears. They had crossed the border. They had done it. North Korea was below them. The revolution was real. At 3:16 p.m., the wheels of Flight 351 touched the runway at Gimpo Airport, Seoul, South Korea. Outside, the banners fluttered. The North Korean flags moved in the afternoon breeze. The women in traditional dress stood ready with their flowers. Children began to sing. Takamoto Tamiya descended the aircraft stairs with his sword in hand, tears streaming down his face, stepping onto what he believed was the soil of his ideological homeland. And then he stopped walking. His eyes had found something on the tarmac that his brain was refusing to process. A fuel truck, parked at the edge of the apron, away from the main activity, perhaps left there by oversight or simply overlooked in the rushed preparations. On its side, in the company's distinctive red and yellow branding, was the Shell Oil logo. Shell. Royal Dutch Shell, one of the largest and most recognizably Western multinational corporations on Earth. A company that was, in the political reality of 1970, about as welcome inside North Korea as the American military itself. A communist state that refused virtually all contact with Western countries and corporations would not have a Shell Oil fuel truck sitting openly on its airport tarmac. It was not ideologically possible. It was not practically possible. It was not possible in any way. Tamiya's eyes began moving faster now, scanning the environment with the sudden sharp attention of someone who has just realized they may have made a catastrophic error. Parked near the terminal, partially visible between two low buildings, an aircraft with Northwestern Airlines livery on its tail. An American commercial carrier. operating, apparently, out of one of the most isolated and anti-American airports on the planet. And then, through the terminal window, walking with the unhurried ease of someone on routine duty, an African-American man in what was clearly a United States military uniform. Right there, in North Korea. The euphoria drained out of Tamia's face so completely and so quickly that it was almost like watching a mask fall off. He walked directly to the South Korean official who had come forward to greet the aircraft and asked a single, quiet question. "If this is Pyongyang, show me a portrait of the great leader Kim Il-sung." Every detail of the deception had been prepared. The flags, the uniforms, the banners, the children, the flowers, the fighters, the welcome announcement. But somewhere in the frantic overnight preparations, no one had thought to place a large portrait of Kim Il-sung, the most omnipresent image in all of North Korea, visible in every public space in the country, anywhere near the arrivals area. Someone ran. People began making urgent phone calls. There was visible confusion among the officials on the tarmac. Tamia watched them run, watched the scramble, watched the panic that moved through the carefully costumed South Korean personnel like a current. One of the other hijackers grabbed a passing soldier by the arm and asked him directly in English, "Is this Seoul?" The soldier, caught entirely off guard, responded before he could stop himself. "Yes." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Tamia turned back toward the aircraft, his voice carrying across the tarmac. "Get back inside! Close the door! This is not North Korea! This is South Korea! They have tricked us!" The door sealed. The stairs were pulled back. The welcome party on the tarmac stood in stunned disarray, surrounded by North Korean flags and wilting flowers and children who had stopped singing. One portrait. That was all it took. One image that no one had thought to put up. The entire elaborate deception, the flags, the soldiers, the fighter jets, the children's songs, the welcome announcements, undone by a single absent photograph of a dictator. The aircraft sat on the Gimpo tarmac, sealed and silent, surrounded by South Korean military and watched by every intelligence agency operating in the region. Inside, the situation had become desperate in ways that went far beyond fear. The passengers had now been confined and bound for more than 30 hours. The aircraft's auxiliary power systems were limited. The air conditioning had failed. The temperature inside the cabin was rising steadily in the afternoon heat, and the smell of sweat and stress and the overflowing lavatories that had not been serviced since Fukuoka was overwhelming. Food and water were almost entirely gone. Passengers who had been bound for so many hours were experiencing genuine circulatory problems in their hands and feet. The psychological weight of captivity, not knowing if the next sound would be an explosion or a rescue, had reduced many of the remaining passengers to a state of near-complete withdrawal. Outside, the diplomatic situation was equally immovable. Japan and South Korea were at an impasse that neither government knew how to break without catastrophic consequences. South Korea's position was straightforward and firm. These were Marxist revolutionaries, enemies of the South Korean state, and under no circumstances should they be permitted to leave the country alive and continue to North Korea. The South Korean government wanted to seize the aircraft, neutralize the hijackers, and present the world with a clean outcome. Japan's position was equally firm and completely incompatible. There were approximately 100 Japanese citizens still inside that aircraft. If the South Koreans made an aggressive move, if they sent in troops, if they tried to force the aircraft door, and the hijackers responded by detonating their explosives, not a single person would survive. Japan was not willing to accept that risk for any political calculation. The auxiliary engine starter that the aircraft needed to restart its engines and take off was in the possession of the South Korean ground crew. South Korea refused to provide it. The aircraft couldn't move without it. The hijackers couldn't go anywhere. And so the hours accumulated, each one heavier than the last. International media had gathered at Gimpo. Television cameras were broadcasting to networks across the United States, Europe, and Asia. The United Nations was being briefed. Diplomatic cables were crossing between Tokyo, Seoul, Washington, and Moscow. The world was watching a tarmac in South Korea and waiting. After more than 20 hours on the ground at Gimpo, Tamiya issued what he described as a final warning. The passengers would not survive another night on this aircraft. If the South Korean government did not provide the starter equipment and allow the aircraft to leave for North Korea within a defined time frame, he would begin destroying the plane. It was at this point that a 53-year-old Japanese government bureaucrat made the most extraordinary decision of his life. His name was Shinjiro Yamamura. His title was Vice Minister of the Ministry of Transport, a senior government official, a career civil servant, someone who had spent decades navigating the careful, procedural world of Japanese bureaucracy. He was not a soldier. He was not a hostage negotiator. He had no special training for crisis situations. He was a government official in a suit who had flown to Seoul as part of the Japanese delegation trying to resolve the standoff diplomatically. Standing on the tarmac at Gimpo, with the deadlock showing no sign of breaking and the threat from inside the aircraft growing more specific and more urgent, Yamamura put forward a proposal so simple and so genuinely terrifying in its implications that the room fell silent when he said it. He would go onto the aircraft as a substitute hostage. If Tamiya and the others agreed to release every remaining passenger, all of them, everyone still bound inside that cabin, then Yamamura would take their place. He would fly with the hijackers to North Korea. He would be their guarantee of safety during the journey. He was offering to fly himself, voluntarily, into North Korea, one of the most closed and hostile states on Earth, with 9 revolutionaries who had just been deceived and humiliated and were operating on very little sleep and a great deal of desperation. There was no guarantee North Korea would permit him to leave. There was no diplomatic channel that could reliably reach Pyongyang. There was no rescue operation that could extract him if things went wrong. He was, in the most direct possible sense, betting his life on the goodwill of a regime that had demonstrated no particular interest in goodwill. The Japanese delegation considered his proposal in silence. They approved it. The offer was transmitted to Tamiya through the aircraft radio. There was a pause, a long pause. Tamiya conferred with his group. Then he accepted. The aircraft door opened. The stairs came down, and one by one, slowly, carefully, some needing physical support, the remaining passengers of Flight 351 walked down those stairs and onto the tarmac and into the arms of waiting medical personnel.
Some were weeping. Some were completely silent, their faces blank with the particular emptiness that comes after sustained terror finally releases its grip. Some were simply shaking, their bodies working through everything their minds had been suppressing for 3 days. There were people who had not spoken to their families in 72 hours. People whose relatives had been watching the news coverage, seeing the aircraft on screen, and not knowing for 3 days whether the people they loved were alive. They were free. And Shinjiro Yamamura walked past them, moving in the opposite direction, and boarded the aircraft.
April 3rd, 1970. 79 hours after the hijacking began at Haneda Airport on an ordinary Tuesday morning, 13 people on board Flight 351 for its last departure, 9 hijackers, 3 crew members who had stayed with their aircraft through the entire ordeal, and 1 vice minister of the Japanese government who had chosen to be there. The auxiliary engine starter was finally provided. The engines turned over. The aircraft moved. Flight 351 lifted off from Gimpo Airport for the last time at approximately 6 p.m., climbing into the early evening sky over Seoul, turning northwest and heading toward the real North Korea. The flight was quiet. Yamamura sat among the hijackers who were exhausted. 79 hours of sustained tension, the crash of having their victory snatched away at Gimpo, the weight of what they had done and what they still faced. The revolutionary fire that had carried them this far was burning very low. At 7:20 p.m., the wheels of Flight 351 touched the runway at Miram Airport, Pyongyang, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This time, it was real. The flags here were not props. The uniforms were genuine North Korean military. The airport buildings were real, their architecture unlike anything in South Korea or Japan. Austere, monumental, designed to project the power of the state. North Korean officials boarded the aircraft. Their first instruction was delivered without ceremony. All weapons were to be surrendered before anyone left the plane. The hijackers complied, and then the officials examined the weapons. The pistols? Fake. Plastic and metal prop replicas, the kind used in theater productions. The pipe bombs? Fake. Cylinders of metal and tape containing nothing that could detonate. The hand grenades? Also fake. Realistic enough in appearance to cause terror, incapable of harming anyone. The only genuine weapon among the entire arsenal of 9 hijackers was a single axe. 9 people had held 122 passengers hostage across 3 countries, triggered a 50-hour diplomatic crisis, forced an international deception operation, and paralyzed 2 governments, with 1 axe and a collection of props that a determined child could have seen through in better lighting. They had done it entirely on conviction, on the absolute, unshakable certainty that they were right, that their cause was just, and that everyone around them, the passengers, the pilots, the authorities, the governments, would respond to the appearance of force the same way they would respond to force itself. And they had been correct, because that is how fear works. Fear does not check credentials. Fear does not ask for proof. Fear responds to what it sees, and what those 9 students showed the world was terrifying enough to work. North Korea did not arrest the hijackers. It gave them asylum. In the official framing of the North Korean state, these were anti-imperialist revolutionaries who had struck a blow against Japanese capitalism and American influence. They were not criminals. They were comrades. At least initially, They were treated as such, referred to in official communications as internationalist fighters, given housing, provided with basic necessities. But the reality of their situation became clear quite quickly. They were settled in a specially designated area near Pyongyang, a controlled community, effectively a gilded cage where they were given Korean-style housing, monitored continuously, and prevented from moving freely within the country. The military training they had crossed the world to receive never came. The connections to the international revolutionary network they had planned to build never materialized. The plan to return to Japan and ignite the uprising never progressed beyond conversation. North Korea had extracted from the hijacking exactly what it wanted: an international incident that embarrassed Japan and South Korea, proof that Pyongyang could serve as a sanctuary for those who opposed American-aligned governments in Asia. And then it moved on. The 9 students had served their propaganda purpose. Now they were simply residents, monitored and contained. The years passed. Some of the hijackers married, in some cases to North Korean women provided by the state. Some had children. They learned Korean. They adapted because adaptation was the only option available to them. Takeshi Okamoto, one of the 9, eventually attempted to escape North Korea with his wife. He was killed. His wife was killed with him. Decades went by. Japan changed. The Red Army faction collapsed. The Cold War ended. The world the hijackers had tried to overturn was transformed by forces none of them could have predicted or controlled. And still they remained in Pyongyang, growing older in a country that had never really been theirs. In a rare interview conducted many years later, Moriaki Wakabayashi, the rock bassist who had traded his instrument for a prop weapon and his career for a North Korean village, reflected on what he had done. He said it had been selfish, childish, that they had been so consumed by the idea of revolution that they had lost the ability to see the actual people they were harming: the passengers, the crew, the families watching from home, the officials whose lives they had disrupted or destroyed. He said that in the heat of that ideology, he had genuinely believed he was making the world better. He had believed it so completely that he had been willing to terrify more than 100 innocent people to prove it. He had lost everything: his music, his country, his freedom, his future. Whether he found anything in exchange is a question that only he could answer, and he answered it in the only way that matters: by admitting, decades too late, that it had not been worth it. International pressure on North Korea to release Yamamura and the 3 crew members began immediately. Japan raised the issue through every available diplomatic channel. Third-party governments applied quiet pressure. The international community watched. The negotiations were slow, difficult, and conducted almost entirely through intermediaries, since Japan and North Korea had no direct diplomatic relationship. But eventually, after weeks that must have felt far longer than they were, North Korea agreed to release the Japanese nationals. Yamamura and the crew came home. They landed in Japan to a reception that no government official could normally expect. Crowds at the airport, cameras everywhere. A nation that had watched the whole thing unfold and understood exactly what Yamamura had done and why. He became almost immediately
a figure of national admiration, not a politician who had made a popular speech or won an election, a man who had simply looked at a situation where innocent people were in danger and decided that his own safety was a secondary consideration. His political career, which had been solid but unremarkable before the hijacking, accelerated dramatically. He went on to serve as Minister of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. He served as Minister of Transport. He became one of the more respected figures in Japanese public life during the 1970s and into the 1980s. In 1992, his daughter, who had struggled for years with severe mental illness, attacked and killed him at home. The man who had survived 3 days in the hands of armed hijackers, who had flown voluntarily into North Korea with no guarantee of return, who had been celebrated as a national hero and built a distinguished public career on the foundation of one act of extraordinary courage, killed quietly at home by the illness of someone he loved. History rarely delivers its endings with any sense of proportion or justice.
The hijacking of JAL Flight 351 was the first hijacking in Japanese aviation history. It was also one of the first major airline hijackings anywhere in the world to demonstrate how catastrophically vulnerable commercial aviation was to a determined group of people willing to use the threat of violence, whether or not that threat was backed by real weapons. In the aftermath, Japan introduced significant changes to airport security screening procedures. The concept of checking passengers and their luggage for weapons before boarding, which seems completely obvious today but was far from standard practice in 1970, was accelerated and formalized by incidents like this one. The event also forced a reckoning in several governments about the intersection of domestic radical politics and international terrorism, a category that didn't really have a clear name or framework in 1970, but would become one of the defining security concerns of the following decades. The Red Army faction continued to operate after 1970, carrying out further attacks, including a machine gun massacre at Tel Aviv's Lod Airport in 1972, carried out in coordination with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The same ideology that had put 9 students on Flight 351 would eventually contribute to some of the worst political violence of the 1970s. In 2025, a South Korean film titled Good News dramatized the events of the Flight 351 hijacking for contemporary audiences, a recognition that more than 50 years later, the story still has the power to disturb and astonish in roughly equal measure. Here is what the story of JAL Flight 351 actually is, at its core. On the surface, it is an extraordinary piece of aviation history. A hijacking so logistically bizarre, so packed with unexpected twists, that it would be rejected as implausible if it was submitted as a film script. Fake weapons, a school atlas as a navigation map, an entire airport disguised as a different country overnight, a portrait of a dictator that nobody remembered to hang. But underneath all of that, it is a story about what happens when ideology becomes total. When the idea becomes so large and so certain that the people holding it can no longer see the human beings standing in its way. Those 9 students were not born violent. They were not born callous. They were young people who grew up in a real political situation, a Japan genuinely compromised by foreign influence, where real injustices existed and real grievances were legitimate. And they took a wrong turn somewhere between anger and action. They were so certain they were right
that they were willing to terrify more than 100 innocent people who had nothing to do with any of the politics they cared about. A priest reading his prayers, a child holding its mother's arm, a businessman with a dinner reservation. None of those people were the enemy. None of them deserved what happened to them. That is what ideology does at its most dangerous. It dissolves the boundary between the idea and the person until the person in front of you stops being a person and starts being an obstacle or a tool or simply background scenery in the drama you've decided you're living in. And against all of that, against the weapons and the threats and the ideology and the terror, the thing that actually broke the situation open was a man in a suit who looked at a plane full of frightened people and said 4 words: "Take me and stand." No weapon, no ideology, no manifesto, no certainty about how history was supposed to unfold, just a decision made quietly that other people's lives were worth more than his own safety. Flight 351 eventually landed safely. The passengers went home to their families and their dinner reservations and their meetings and their ordinary lives. The hijackers grew old in a country that had given them asylum and then essentially forgotten about them. Yamamura became a hero and then, 22 years later, died in a way that had nothing to do with any of it. And somewhere in the archives of aviation history, the incident sits quietly, a reminder that the most dangerous weapon ever carried onto an aircraft was not made of steel or plastic or explosive material. It was made of absolute conviction. And the most powerful thing anyone said during 79 hours of crisis, more powerful than any threat, more effective than any deception, more lasting than any ideology, was a single simple offer to take someone else's place. That is the story of Flight 351. That is where it leaves you.